And then in your honor, I'm giving you a party. We're having ice cream and old-fashioned dessert social. So please save your appetites, all right? From the bottom of my heart, I thank all of you for your support. I thank you all for great things that you've done. I have to report to you that with this year, we had 34 angels. We're almost up to 50. That's our cutoff. We have 3 more angel spots left if you want to become an angel. The angels bring the writers here. It's because of them that we have Dave Barry, Scott Berg, and today our speaker. So I want to introduce, this year we added a format of moderators. Do you enjoy the moderators? They've really added a lot. Well, I am very proud to introduce one of our local, one of great philanthropists, a great writer in his own way, and a dear friend. There's no one better than to introduce this subject than our own Hal Dershowitz. Let's give him a welcome.
Well, we are delighted to have with us Pulitzer Prize winning New York Times journalist Eric Lichtblau with us this morning to discuss his latest book, The Nazis Next Door, How America Became a Safe Haven for Hitler's Men. And what a book it is. And who better to have written it? Eric Lichtblau, with 30 years of reporting experience, has covered the U.S. Justice Department for the New York Times for the past 13 years. He also covered justice while working in the Los Angeles Times Washington Bureau before that. The Nazis Next Door was, to me, a gut-wrenching read. Think about it. Following a war that claimed 60 million victims worldwide. Now that's about 3% of the entire population of the planet at the time. A war that killed 420,000 American servicemen, former Nazis, by the thousands, made their way to safe haven in the United States of America. Eric Lichtblau lays bare the sad and painful reality that some of the worst found their way here through the complicity of agencies of our own American government. Now, most Americans may accept the fact that top Nazis, scientists such as Wernher von Braun, were given a pass so that they could design and build rockets for us rather than for the Soviets. But how do we even begin to explain the welcome mat our government provided for Nazi functionaries, some of whom were intimately involved with the deportation and slaughter of millions? They did their work at Auschwitz, at the Ponary pits outside of Vilnius, Lithuania, Dachau, Krasnodar in the Ukraine, Sobibor, Flossenburg, Majdanek, and so many other blood-stained places. We, of course, know the answer to that rhetorical question. If we thought they could help us in the Cold War battle we knew was coming, we found a way to open the door for them. I couldn't help but think, when I was reading Eric's case studies, what would the GIs have thought, those who were storming the beaches at Normandy, if they knew that so many of Hitler's men would be invited to make their home in the cities and suburbs of America? Think about that, too. This is a story that had to be told. It's a story that had been hidden away for too many years, and no one could have told it better than our next guest. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Eric Lichtblau.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Hal, for that overly kind introduction. You flatter me, but it's great to be here and to talk to you about what I think is a critical topic and a little-known and shameful saga in American history, and that is the flight of thousands of Nazis into America after the war. Now, I usually write about modern-day events for the New York Times. My first book was on the war on terrorism, looking back at the first 8 years or so after terrorism. History is not something I've written about in this depth before, and this book really came about almost by accident. I got a tip about 4 years ago now from an old source of mine at the Justice Department who indicated that there was a secret internal history at the Justice Department that had never seen the light of day, 700 pages, that laid bare the history of the government's not only investigation of Nazis who got into America, but the government's own relationship with those Nazis and help in letting them get into the country after 1945. It almost sounded to me like a Pentagon Papers for Nazis, and the source had said that there was a lot of fascinating history here that really deserved to be told to the American public. Now, if there's one surefire way to get a reporter's attention in Washington, it's to tell them that there's a secret government report that they don't want you to have. It's sort of like waving a slab of meat in front of a hungry dog's face and telling him to go get it. And I was determined to try and get a hold of this report, and ultimately through some phone calls and a bit of good luck, I did. And it became a front-page story in the New York Times. But I think almost before I finished writing the story, I realized that this was a subject that deserved a closer examination than you could really do in 2,000 words in a newspaper story. This told not only of the ease with which thousands of Nazis had sneaked in on their own into America, but how some of them had help from the CIA, from the Pentagon, from the military, in ways that the American public had never imagined before. I was determined to write a book about this. I thought that some of the details in the report were so captivating. I remember a little episode that was referenced in this internal history about a Justice Department lawyer in the 1980s who was assigned to look into the reported death of Mengele, Dr. Death, in Bolivia. And they weren't sure whether it was really Mengele or not. There were all sorts of sightings, false sightings and things. So he kept, in the days before DNA, for a week or so, he had locked in his desk drawer a piece of scalp from what was thought to be Mengele in Bolivia, and they were going to test it with the forensics then available to them to figure out whether or not it was in fact Mengele, and it turned out it was. I mean, these were the sort of details that almost made for a novel as much as a nonfiction history. And so I started this book. I interviewed dozens and dozens of Justice Department investigators who, beginning around 1980, had tried belatedly to identify and deport Nazis who had gotten into America. I filed Freedom of Information Act requests. I spent weeks and weeks looking through declassified war crimes records at the National Archives in Washington, which were really a treasure trove of information about what the government knew beginning in 1945 about the people it was using, not only as scientists, but as spies and intelligence assets in the Cold War against the Soviets. And there were many, many things that were both shocking and revolting to me. As much as I thought I knew about this story before I started my research, I was really aghast at the level of complicity, for instance, by CIA officials using spies who they knew, they had memos in their own files, were deeply involved in war crimes. But I think the one area that I think revolted me more than any other had nothing to do with the Nazis directly. It had to do with the Holocaust survivors, and that was a group that I didn't plan to really even examine or write about in the book when I first started my research. Their plight, as horrible as it was, seems somewhat separate from the question of how so many Nazis were able to get into America. But I realized as I did my research that that the plight of the Holocaust survivors was really central to this whole issue. It was really the flip side of the exodus of the Nazis, because to understand how easy it was for the Nazis, thousands of them, to get into the country, you first had to understand how difficult it was for the Holocaust survivors to get out of the camps. This is General George S. Patton on the right, with then General, future President Dwight Eisenhower in the center. The displaced persons camps were set up by the Allies, run by the U.S., and each of the victors, the Russians, the French, the British, and the U.S., ran their own camps. And we remember now the liberation of the Nazi concentration camps. And I think you can almost imagine that the gates swung open and the survivors flooded out to warm beds, to hot meals, to showers, to homes. And really, it was nothing like that. And I think that that's been lost to history. So if you'll indulge me for a minute, I'll read a little bit from the opening chapter of the book, which is called Liberation. Spring 1945, Fehrenwald displaced persons camp outside Munich. While the Nazis fled, their victims were left to languish. These were the lucky ones, hundreds of thousands of Jews, Catholics, gays, Jehovah's Witnesses, communists, Roma gypsies, and other quote-unquote parasites enslaved in Nazi concentration camps who somehow had managed to survive Hitler's genocidal killing machine. Yet even after Germany's defeat, the survivors remained imprisoned for months in the same camps where the Nazis had first put them to rot. The names of their jailers had changed, with the dark Nazi swastikas now replaced by the bright-colored flags of the Allied victors flying above the camps, but the barbed wire fences and armed guards still encircled them. They were in a post-war purgatory, living in conditions that, as a high-level emissary of President Truman would painfully have to acknowledge, were little different from those imposed on them by the Nazis themselves. Jakob Bieber, a Jew who survived the Nazi purge in the Ukraine, was among the masses confined in the American DP camp at Fehrenwald. Quote, "We felt like so much surplus junk," Bieber would write of his confinement, "human garbage which the governments of the world wished would somehow go away." Now you had, even after the Allied victory, and even after General Patton took over the operations of the displaced persons camps, you had Holocaust survivors who somehow had survived the Holocaust, and yet were dying because of malnutrition, because of disease, and occasionally even suicide, because they believed that the gates of the world were locked to them. There were virtually no visas to the United States in those first few years after the war. The British were blocking the way to Palestine. The women and children in the camps would sing these songs, these plaintive songs in Yiddish, about why wouldn't anyone take them, as Jakob Bieber was saying, why doesn't anyone care about us locked in these camps? And to fully appreciate just how horrific the situation was, you had food rations that would deny extra rations to the Jewish survivors because they didn't want to be seen as getting more food than the Nazi POWs in those same camps. And black markets emerged where the Jews and the other Holocaust survivors were trading and trafficking in foodstuff and other supplies because they couldn't get them through the normal channels. And in fact, the Allied commanders put down some of the black markets. There was even violence as they tried to suppress the black markets. Now, the Nazi POWs not only had equal treatment in some cases with the Jewish prisoners in the displaced person camps, in some cases they were running those camps on the orders of General Patton to the right here, who openly defied General Eisenhower's orders to denazify the camps. He told his people that if the Nazi civilians were the ones in the best position to run those camps, they should be left to do it. So you had Nazi POWs who were not only sometimes bunked side by side with Jewish Holocaust survivors in these horrible camps, but sometimes were the civilians lording over them. You even had Nazi nurses and doctors who had been the supposed medical staff, however you want to define medical staff in a Nazi concentration camp, continuing in that role in the Allied camps. So I mentioned that there was a report to Truman that was prepared by the University of Pennsylvania Law School dean, a man by the name of Earl Harrison. And he went over. Jewish groups began complaining. They were telling Washington, do you realize how these people who we just liberated are living in the early months? So he went over about 6 months after and toured and inspected a bunch of the camps. And this was what he declared, which I think even for the standards of blistering reports in Washington is unlike any I've ever read. He wrote, "As matters now stand, we appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis treated them, except that we do not exterminate them. They are in concentration camps in large numbers under our military guard instead of SS troops. One is led to wonder whether the German people, seeing this, are not supposing that we are following or at least condoning Nazi policy." Now, General Patton was furious when he read this report. This was an attack on his own command of the displaced persons camps. And he wrote in his journal about the report. And I came across a copy of his handwritten journal at the U.S. Holocaust Museum, where I did a fellowship for most of last year while I was writing this book, and came across his reaction to the Harrison report, which at first I thought might be a forgery. It was difficult to imagine that a U.S. war hero, he was known as Old Blood and Guts, he's currently deified in a book by Bill O'Reilly that's a bestseller, had really written these words. But unfortunately, I was able to verify that, in fact, Patton had written these things. And what he said in response to Dean Harrison's report was this: "Harrison and his ilk believe that the displaced person is a human being, which he is not. And this applies particularly to the Jews, who are lower than animals," Patton wrote in his diary after learning of the scathing report to Truman. Laying bare the rabid anti-Semitism that infected the American refugee effort, Patton complained of how the Jews in one DP camp with no sense of human relationships would defecate on the floors and live in filth like lazy, quote-unquote, locusts. He told of taking General Eisenhower to tour a makeshift synagogue that the Jews in the camps had set up to celebrate the holy day of Yom Kippur. Quote, "We entered the synagogue, which was packed with the greatest stinking mass of humanity I have ever seen," end quote. This was Eisenhower's first glimpse of the DPs, Patton wrote, so it was all new to him. Quote, "Of course, I have seen them since the beginning and marvel that beings alleged to be made in the form of God can look the way they do or act the way they act." So on the one hand, you're left to wonder, how could it be that the survivors were treated this way by the Allies? On the other hand, when you read something like that from General Patton, it's no wonder that they were treated the way they were, and it's no wonder that visas to the United States and anywhere else outside the camps were in such limited supply because they were held in such disdain by the people who ruled over them. At that same time, you had visas that were numbering in the hundreds of thousands in areas outside the concentration camps. In Eastern Europe, there were about 400,000 visas granted to the United States from countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, and elsewhere. And this was a part of the Cold War. I think the two biggest factors that I cite repeatedly in my book are lingering anti-Semitism, which I've talked about, and the Cold War, this new Soviet threat. Almost before the war was won against the Germans, you had Cold Warriors like Allen Dulles, who went on to become the first director of the CIA, already turning their attention to the Soviets, who were ostensibly our partners during the war. They realized very quickly that the Soviets were the new threat and the Nazis were yesterday's enemy. And they were determined to exploit and capitalize on anti-communist fervor among the Nazis. The Nazis were seen as those who hated and loathed the Soviets more than anyone else, and who had the knowledge and resources from fighting them over the years. They knew the railroad lines in what would become the Soviet zone. They were able to lay cables to potentially do intercepts and spycraft on the Soviets. They had language skills that the US did not have. And you had hundreds of thousands of people let in from Eastern Europe for the primary reason that they were seen as staunchly anti-communist. They were about to be taken over by the Soviet Empire and live under another form of tyranny after having been occupied by the Nazi regime for the duration of the war in countries like Latvia and Estonia and Croatia. And the United States policymakers who were determining visa allotments believed that these were people, if you look at the congressional record, who were quote unquote of good stock or of good breeding and were staunchly anti-communist. We wanted those people in the United States before the Soviets could get their hands on them. The people in the camps, on the other hand, the Jews, were described in congressional record testimony as lazy and entitled, and visas for the first 3 or 4 years after the war were virtually non-existent. It wasn't until about 1950 or 1951 that visas in large numbers became available to Jews and other survivors under the Displaced Persons Act, but that took the better part of 5 years. So the vast majority, I would say, of the 400,000 refugees who came from Eastern Europe were in fact legitimate war refugees in every sense of the word, people who had just been victimized by the Nazis or were about to be taken over by the Soviets. But it's also now clear from the declassified war crime files that I looked at for my book that among those 400,000, there were a not insignificant number of top Nazi collaborators who were not the victims of the Nazi occupation, but were the willing executioners who had led the purge on the Jews. I estimate that number to be anywhere from 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 of top Nazi collaborators, some who wore the Nazi uniform, others who worked hand in hand with the Gestapo, who were able to come into America. And it was fairly easy to do under the overwhelmed immigration system. If you put yourself down as a farmer or a civilian or even a POW, in the war, you were, especially from Eastern Europe, you were very likely to get into the United States. If you listed yourself as a top SS officer, that would probably not get you in. So you had people come into the United States who, like Otto von Bolschwing, who was a Prussian baron, who not only was a top aide to this man, Adolf Eichmann, but also was a top officer in the SD who helped in, for instance, pogroms in Bucharest where thousands of Jews were killed. Now, von Bolschwing didn't come straight to America. First, he went to work for the CIA in Europe. And the CIA knew of his past. They knew that he was a Nazi SS officer. They would later claim, we didn't know just how bad a Nazi he was, as ridiculous as that now sounds, but at the time, that was not an unusual opinion. I mentioned Allen Dulles, who was a top US intelligence official during the war in Switzerland and went on to become the head of the CIA. And let's see, let's find a picture of Dulles. There's Allen Dulles on the right next to Kennedy. Allen Dulles, even before the war was over, was holding a top secret meeting in Zurich with a Nazi general on the left here by the name of Karl Wolff, who had been the chief of staff to the man on the right, SS Chief Heinrich Himmler. Wolff, on the left, was the one who set up the train network, taking millions to their deaths at the concentration camps. Yet Dulles met with him months before the end of the war because he saw Wolff as an ally, perhaps in ending the war perhaps a little bit earlier. Everyone knew Hitler at that point was going to lose. It was just a question of when. And in fact, Wolff did get his men to lay down their arms in Italy a few weeks earlier than everyone else. But Dulles also saw him as an intelligence asset in the coming Cold War. And this was how he described Nazi General Wolff after they held, I say sarcastically, a lovely meeting at a safe house in Zurich where they sipped scotch and talked in German over a fireside. This was how Dulles described the meeting when he cabled back to Washington about that. What he said was, I'm sorry, give me a second here. I've lost my page. What he said was that Wolff is a distinctive personality and a dynamic man too. Our reports and impressions indicate that he represents the more moderate element in the Waffen-SS with a mixture of romanticism. The general's aim, Dulles cabled, was to help lead Germany out of war and, quote, end the useless material and human destruction. Wolff was handsome and trustworthy too, Dulles added later, and the Allies would be able to work with him. Those who had met him could plainly see that Wolff was, quote, no ogre. Dulles was also duly impressed by Wolf's Nazi deputies, the senior Black Order officers who had arranged the meeting. He learned that Nazi Captain Guido Zimmer, quote, despite his membership in the SS, was a devout Catholic. Zimmer, somewhat of an intellectual, was moved by a desire to save the art and religious treasures of Italy from ruin if the war continued, Dulles wrote. Zimmer seemed to be a misfit in the SS. He was good-looking, clean-cut, not the way one pictures the typical SS officer. So Dulles was instrumental in using hundreds of Nazis and Nazi collaborators as US spies around the world, about 1,000 by my count, who worked in Europe, in the Middle East, in Latin America, and here in the United States as CIA and intelligence assets, despite their horrible, horrible pasts with the Nazis. I mentioned Otto von Bolschwing, who you see here. He worked in Austria for the CIA, and while he was seen as someone who could help in this bold new Cold War, he, like many of the other Nazi spies, turned out to be a mediocre spy at best. You know, we had basically sacrificed, I would argue, our moral principles for the sake of a national security gain. And with the scientists, I think that Hal talked about, you certainly see a clear national security benefit, morality aside, that they brought to the United States in building rockets. With the spies, like Otto von Bolschwing, it's hard to even make that claim because so many of them, not shockingly, turned out to be embezzlers, cheats, liars, thieves, and in a few cases, believe it or not, even Soviet double agents. So I tell the story in the book of Otto von Bolschwing in about 1954, who was dispatched in Austria by the CIA to deliver an important batch of CIA spy photos and documents with the real names of CIA contacts in Europe. This was a critical assignment, and he was taking a train to Hamburg to deliver those documents to an intelligence contact. But when he got to Hamburg, he realized that he had mistakenly mixed up his own bag with another man's, and instead of the spy documents inside, he found a bag of toiletries and pajamas. Now, if that were you or me who had just bungled an assignment so badly, and by the way, had also been a top Nazi SS officer to Adolf Eichmann, I think it's likely would have been fired. Not only didn't the CIA fire Otto von Bolschwing at that point, there was a mild reprimand in his file that he shouldn't lose satchels like that again, but they relocated him and his family to New York City, his wife and his teenage son, as what they called a reward for his loyal service in Europe in the 1950s, and in view of what they called, and this is their word, not mine, the innocuousness of his work for the Nazis. And in fact, they went to great lengths. Mrs. von Bolschwing was afraid of flying, so rather than fly her to the United States, they put her on a luxury ship and tended to her concerns before they arrived in New York, and they even stayed for a while with a military officer in Boston before they moved to New York. And von Bolschwing sadly lived out his life for the next 25 years in the United States. There's a picture of him, and I'll get to this in a little bit, in a nursing home in 1980. Now, he did that with the help of the CIA, because about 5 years after he came to the United States, von Bolschwing learned, like the rest of the world, of a brazen raid that the Israelis had mounted in Argentina to capture his old boss, Adolf Eichmann. And von Bolschwing was worried, understandably, that the Israelis, as they were about to put Eichmann on trial, might learn of his own role as a top aide to Eichmann. And he had reason to worry, because at Eichmann's trial, he mentioned von Bolschwing by name 4 times at the testimony, and even credited him as an inspiration for some of the early policies on ways to terrorize the Jews. In fact, von Bolschwing had written a paper called The Jewish Problem, in which he said that the way to terrorize the Jews was in the years before the use, this was before gas chambers were put to use in the final solution, but in the few years before that, Germany needed to find ways to terrorize Jews and make them feel so unsecure and hated in Germany that they would have no choice but to flee. This was a white paper that he wrote for Eichmann, and his name came out at testimony in the trial. Now, at that point, von Bolschwing went back to his old handlers at the CIA, who met with him at a restaurant in New York City and heard his concerns about being identified, not only who he was, but where he was and what his role was with Eichmann at that point. So the CIA agreed to protect him. They promised him that they would not tell the Israelis who he was or where he was. They would not tell the US Justice Department or the INS. They would not tell the White House. But there was one condition. The condition was that at that point, von Bolschwing was such a successful businessman in New York in the export-import business that he had been nominated by the State Department for a job in India. And he wanted to hold on to that job. Even after Eichmann's capture, the CIA said, we will protect you, but you have to drop your nomination. And von Bolschwing, believe it or not, actually protested first. He said he'd done a lot to earn this job, and he wanted to keep it. The CIA, on that point, would not negotiate. They said, if you want our protection, you need to drop out of the running for that. And in fact, he did. And it was another 20 years before anyone realized who he was, and he was discovered in Sacramento. Now, we could go on, unfortunately, for hours with similar examples. I'll tell you a couple more. This is a man named Alexandras Leleikis. You see on the left his photo in Lithuania in 1938 in uniform. He was the head of a notorious secret police force known as the Saugumas. I'm probably mispronouncing it. My Lithuanian is not great. But he was a man who would round up thousands of Jews in partnership with the Gestapo in the city of Vilnius. And his signature is on the bottom of the arrest warrants for women, children, men who were brought to the city jail and then handed over to the Gestapo, where they were marched about 7 miles outside of town to a death pit at a place called Panerai, and then machine gunned to death. And there were 60,000 Jews who died at Vilnius in one of the worst massacres of the entire Holocaust. On the right, unfortunately, you see his US naturalization photo in 1976. He lived in Massachusetts, in Boston and central Massachusetts for years and years, and he too, like Otto von Bolschwing, had been a CIA spy in the 1950s in Europe. Again, like von Bolschwing and many others, not a particularly good spy, but he was able to use his connections to get into the United States, to make a life for himself selling Lithuanian encyclopedias, and to essentially erase his past as a top Nazi collaborator in Lithuania. This is a picture at Panerai of just a tiny fraction of the victims there at the death pit at Panerai. This is another man, Walter Hilger, who lived in Washington, my home city, for years and years in the 1950s through the 1960s. Here you see him in his previous life as a top foreign affairs specialist to Hitler, the #2 person in foreign affairs to General Ribbentrop, whose connections to war crimes for the Nazis was so hideous that Ribbentrop was executed at Nuremberg. Yet his #2, Hilger, not only was not prosecuted, but was brought to the United States and worked for years as a covert analyst at the CIA. He would go out to Langley and give briefings on Soviet affairs because he was recognized as an expert. He also held a semi-public life. He had academic cover at institutions like Harvard, and he was listed in the white pages. He even wrote his own memoirs years later. In his memoir, he was unapologetic about his past to the Nazis. He said he had nothing to apologize for, and those who called on him to express some bit of remorse or regret would not get it. Now, there was one person who did raise what amounted to a silent protest, and that was a famous Holocaust historian by the name of Roel Hillman, who wrote The Destruction of the European Jews. And he was doing research in the 1950s in Washington at the National Archives and the Library of Congress at around the same time as Hilger, who you see here, was writing his own memoir. And when he would see Hilger across the way at a cubicle doing his work with no scrutiny, no attention, he realized no one really cared, and at least he was not going to sit still while someone like that was 10 yards away, so he would get up and walk out in silent protest. But Hilger lived out his life in the United States and died an American citizen. Now, we talked a little bit about the scientists, and I'll just spend a few minutes on that before we close up here. This is a group of the Nazi scientists. You see the most famous among them, Werner von Braun, on the right. third from the right, a very good-looking, dashing guy who went on to make Hollywood specials for Disney in the 1950s. He became a folk hero. He was even lionized in popular songs at the time. Not as well known, but almost as important on the left was Arthur Rudolph, the balding man foreign from the right, who was von Braun's top deputy. This is a picture of dozens of the scientists in Texas after they came to America under a program called Operation Paperclip. Now, this was at first a secret program. We began bringing the scientists over within months. I mentioned General Patton, who is, I think it's fair to say, one of the villains in my book. In addition to disdaining the Jews, he held the Nazis in some high regard. And I tell the story in the book at those displaced persons camps in the POW barracks of General Patton going into the barracks where some of the Nazi scientists were held and seeking out von Braun's boss, who was a man by the name of General Walter Dornberger. And Dornberger, with von Braun as his protege, had shepherded this revolutionary technology to build the V-2 missiles that Hitler used to strafe Antwerp, London, and other parts of Europe. Patton went up to him and said, "Are you Dornberger?" And Dornberger said, "Jawohl, Herr General." And Patton said to him, "You're the one who built the V-2 rockets?" And again, Dornberger said, "Jawohl, Herr General." So Patton then took 3 cigars out of his pocket and handed them to Dornberger and said, "Well, congratulations, we couldn't have done it." And indeed, within months of the end of the war, we began bringing in first dozens and then hundreds and ultimately 1,600 scientists to the United States to live in Alabama, Texas, Ohio, not far from here in San Diego, on military bases to exploit their knowledge. Now, officially, the Pentagon had to acknowledge the program because within a few months, it was difficult to hide a bunch of elderly men with German accents in Alabama and Texas. They did not exactly fit in. So within a few months, the Pentagon acknowledged the existence of this program, but in what I regard as sort of a masterly bit of public relations, managed to turn this into a Cold War triumph by whitewashing the records of many of these men. Officially under the program that was approved by President Truman and later by President Eisenhower, these could not be quote-unquote ardent Nazis, however one might interpret that term. But in reality, what not being an ardent Nazi meant was that for someone like Arthur Rudolph on the left, he was the production chief at a hideous Nazi slave labor camp at a place called Nordhausen, which was this enormous factory about the size of 10 football fields built into a mountainside where thousands and thousands of slave laborers, most of them actually weren't Jews, but were POWs from France, Poland, Russia, and elsewhere, slept side by side in unlivable conditions, and during the day worked this, what amounted to an assembly line of death to build the V-2 rockets for Werner von Braun and Walter Dornberger and Adolf Hitler. And I say an assembly line of death because thousands died, as many as 10,000 by some estimates, sometimes of disease, which was rampant in the tunnels and the mountain factories, sometimes of starvation, and for those who were the most unlucky, if they were suspected of trying to sabotage the parts on the assembly line, or perhaps not just live up to their quota for that day, they were brought to the center of the factory where there was a huge construction crane, and other prisoners were gathered around, and they were brought to the top of the crane, and they were hanged. So Arthur Rudolph was the man on the ground, the production chief, whose job it was to determine how many workers they needed that day and that month to build Hitler's rockets. And as the war neared an end and Hitler became more desperate, the demand for rockets became even more intense. Hitler wanted more, he wanted them faster. Werner von Braun on the right was not physically at the plant. He was a few hundred miles away at a separate headquarters, but he visited the plant about 15 times during those years. And he worked with the SS at Nazi headquarters to lay out the grand scheme for using slave laborers, thousands of them, and to replace those who died in the course of building the V-2 rockets. And many years later, von Braun was asked, well, what was it like at that slave labor camp? He said, I didn't see anyone mistreated. It seemed fine to me. And in fact, Rudolph on the left even went further. He claimed that the workers there were better fed than he was, and they almost seemed happy. He was asked about workers who had to wear the Star of David, and he said, well, it seemed to them like to be almost a badge of honor. They didn't seem to mind it at all. Rudolph did not become as famous within the general population as von Braun, as his boss in the United States, but within the scientific community, he was almost as prominent. He went on to be called one of the fathers of the Saturn space program. He went on to collect a pension not only from the Nazis, but from NASA and the US government for his work in Florida and later in California. And he became ultimately the first and last Nazi scientist to be prosecuted by the United States in the 1980s, when the government finally began waking up to the fact that there were Nazis in our own backyard. The Justice Department went after him and confronted him with an incontrovertible record of his history, and he agreed to leave the country of his own accord and went back to Germany, where he lived out his life. But there was a backlash at that point from people in the Reagan White House, principally Pat Buchanan, who was a fierce critic of what he called the hairy-chested Nazi hunters at the Justice Department. There were people who thought that we should not be going after men like Arthur Rudolph, who had committed themselves to the US space program, and that their past lives were irrelevant. There were, what I found in the records, as many as a dozen other scientists, several among this photo you see here, who were also investigated at that same time in the 1980s. But with the political resistance and the backlash that was brewing, none of the others was ever prosecuted, and they too lived out their lives in the United States. Here you see a picture of Arthur Rudolph with his Nazi identification card, and if you look closely in the top left and the bottom right, you see the Nazi swastika there. This was at the time that Rudolph was heading up the production effort at that horrible slave labor camp. Here's another Nazi scientist, not a rocketeer like von Braun and Rudolph, but a doctor. There were about 40 Nazi doctors who were brought to Texas because of their skill in medical aviation. Their idea was their agenda was to keep the astronauts alive in space once von Braun and Rudolph helped propel them into space. Now, Strughold was regarded as the father of medical space aviation. What wasn't acknowledged by the US government was how he plied his trade in his early years, and that was by overseeing horrible human experimentation on prisoners at Dachau, including children who were put into flight simulators, not unlike this one you see here, which was in Texas, in Dachau, to the point, and subjected to unthinkable amounts of pressure and gravitational pull, to the point that many died. He would also subject children and adults to having to drink putrid seawater. And the idea there was that during the war, the Germans realized that they were losing a lot of pilots who crashed into the ocean, not because of the force, but because they were drinking so much putrid seawater that they would die of exposure to that. So Strughold and the others were experimenting with ways to purify the water. In the course of doing that, they would force feed it down prisoners at Dachau to see what would kill them and what wouldn't. But in Texas, he was regarded as the father of space aviation, and in fact, there were commemorations in his name, and until just a few years ago, awards that were still named after him in space medicine. Now, I don't want you to think that my book is complete with only villains. There are a few heroes, and this is one of them, a man by the name of Chuck Allen on the left, who I had never heard of when I started my research, but he became sort of a hero to me. In the 1960s, when no one was really talking about Nazis in the United States, Allen began writing stories for obscure left-wing publications, some of them communist-leaning publications, some of them Jewish publications, occasionally one you've heard of like The Nation, about Nazis living in the United States. And he was both a journalist and an activist. You see on the right a poster for a rally that he organized in Brooklyn in 1963. And he organized other rallies in Chicago and also here in Los Angeles in Southern California to draw attention to a problem that no one at that point was talking about. For the most part, he was ignored by political figures and by other media. If not ignored, there were counter-protests. For instance, at a protest in Chicago, a bunch of neo-Nazis came out in a protest in 1963 to denounce his efforts to identify and deport Nazis. But at the FBI, he drew incredible scrutiny to the point that J. Edgar Hoover, who you saw in an earlier photo, approved a national security wiretap on Chuck Allen for years. He was declared a communist subversive and a national security threat, and the FBI wiretapped his phones and trailed him as he went around Washington and New York and sometimes Europe to try and unearth evidence and documentary files on Nazis who were living right here in the United States. And it was not until another 20 years after Allen began trying to draw attention to this problem that the United States really began going after Nazis in 1980. That happened as a result of pressure from Jewish members of Congress, principally Elizabeth Holtzman, who forced the Justice Department to open a whole new office and for the first time really go after Nazis with a team of lawyers, investigators, historians, immigration experts, and they would investigate hundreds of Nazis who were living in cities across the country and eventually prosecute and seek to deport about 130 of them. But at that point, these were men who were at least in their 50s or 60s. Some were older. You saw someone like Otto von Bolschwing, who was then in his deathbed at a Sacramento nursing home. And it was a tragic case, in my view, of too little and too late. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
Before we turn it over to the audience for a couple of questions, I'd like to revisit the story of Alexandros Leleikis.
Sure.
Of all of the case studies you gave in the book, I found that case study the most chilling. And you talk about Mike McQueen, the historian / investigator for the Nazi hunting office of the Justice Department, and how in Lithuania he comes across the annotated card of two of Leleikis' victims, Gita and Fruma Kaplan.
Right.
And you get the impression that they just haunted him when he saw at the bottom of the card, treated according to orders.
Right, orders from the Gestapo, yes.
What that meant. Talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Mike McQueen, who you mentioned, was one of the original Nazi hunters at the Justice Department after that new office was opened in 1980. And Leleikis, the Nazi collaborator in Vilnius, was someone who was under investigation for, let's see, is the mic working there? I think I lost my mic. Can you hear me? Okay, that's better. Under investigation for more than a decade, beginning in the 1980s, the Justice Department was trying to gather enough evidence to deport him while he was selling encyclopedias in Boston. But they didn't think they had enough to move against him in court. They wanted essentially a smoking gun to tie him directly to Nazi atrocities. And Mike McQueen went over to Lithuania, and through the benefit of the end of the Cold War, archives were opened up from Soviet bloc countries like Lithuania, and he began going through thousands and thousands of files. And he ultimately came across files with Leleikis' own signature at the bottom, imprisoning people like Fruma and Gita Kaplan, a mother and daughter. The daughter was, I believe, 8 years old at that point. They were among the thousands who were rounded up, imprisoned in Vilnius temporarily, and then handed over to the Gestapo to be taken outside town and slaughtered. And on his bulletin board, the investigator McQueen had kept a copy of their own arrest warrants because he wanted to personalize. He wanted to make this personal because he was so angry about what had happened. And when he finally found the documents with Leleikis' signature, he called back to Washington and he said, "We got the bastard." And then in the mid-1990s, they finally prosecuted Alexander Leleikis and deported him to Lithuania, where he died while awaiting trial on war crimes.
Questions from the audience? Helene?
No, I have not. I've been. Oh yes. What was did I receive any blowback? Is that what you're asking? Did I get any blowback or reaction from the sons or daughters of any of the victims? And I have not. I talked to many of them in the course of researching this book, and almost to a person, they believe their fathers were wrongly accused, and think that these were this was evidence that was concocted by the Soviets and others. The one key exception to that I spent a lot of time talking. Yeah, yes. I think we might be having a problem with the mic. Can you hear me now? Okay. The one exception to that was the son of Otto von Bolschwing, the aide to Adolf Eichmann, who you saw in the Sacramento nursing home. But I spent a lot of time talking to his son, who, like many of the others, at first believed his father was innocent and there's no way this could be true. But he was a lawyer and ultimately came to believe that his father was in fact this hideous monster that they made him out to be. And there's a scene in the book where he confronts both, at a deposition, both his own father and the CIA, whose lawyers were sitting there. Basically, how could you have done this? Dad, how could you have lied to me for all these years? And the CIA, how could you have used someone like that and now come after him 20 years later? So he really went through this heart-wrenching process of self-exploration.
Bill?
Yeah, in your research, did you find any information at all that touched up to the very top echelon of the administration?
Did I find evidence? How high did it go, basically? The highest that I found was probably Allen Dulles, who I talked about, who went on to be the first director of the CIA under Eisenhower in the 1950s. I mean, he was personally involved in many of these cases, not only using Nazis as spies in the Cold War, but then protecting and intervening on their behalf when accusations would sometimes surface against them. He would come to their aid. J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI was also actively involved, not quite to the extent of Dulles. The White House, from the evidence I've seen, was sort of protected in this. You had official orders, as I mentioned, from Truman and Eisenhower that we were not to use ardent Nazis in the paperclip scientific program, but that was openly ignored by the military officials who were the ones carrying this out. And occasionally people at the State Department would object in the late 1940s and say that we can't be using people like this who are tied to war crimes. And there's one memo that I found in the National Archives where a Pentagon official responds that they needed to get out of the way and let these scientists in, and you should stop beating a dead Nazi.
Yes.
There were a few who changed their names, but the majority kept their names. I mean, again, Otto von Bolschwing, the Eichmann aide, he was living under his real name for years and years in New York and Washington, New York and California. Hilger, who I talked about, the CIA analyst, was in the White Pages in Washington, and the children, for the most part, kept their names. I mean, if their fathers weren't in any great danger, they were in even less danger.
Yes.
I've wondered that. I don't know. Was Bill O'Reilly aware of this information about Patton when he wrote his best-selling book, sort of glorifying him? I don't know. I'm not sure if anyone has directly confronted him about that. I mean, I think someone should, because I think it's outrageous that such a key part of his record is completely lost to history.
You should.
I should. Okay, next time I see Bill O'Reilly, if he invited me on his show, I would, but he hasn't invited me yet.
Well, one of the things that I thought came across loud and clear in the book was that a lot of the CIA interrogation of these people who they knew had committed serious crimes was not so much to eliminate them, but to see if they would come clean.
Right, exactly. I talk about one guy by the name of Tom Subsikov, who was an SS officer from the Caucasus who moved around Europe with the Nazis, and he was his role with the Nazis was dismissed by the CIA as what they called minor war crimes, which was such a jarring phrase, I made that the title of one chapter, Minor War Crimes. And they pressed him on what he had really done during the war, not because they didn't want to have a Nazi on their payroll, but because they wanted to make sure they could trust him. They wanted him to tell them the truth about what he had done so that they could pass the polygraphs, basically. And he was ultimately fired by the CIA, not because of his minor war crimes with the Nazis, but because he kept lying to them about his past. But it worked out okay for him because the FBI then used him as an informant in New Jersey.
We have time for one more question. Diana?
It seems to be the government in the States had a lot of anti-Semitism, because how did they allow so many of these Nazis to come in to work for the government, and yet they sort of turned their faces a little bit away, pretending that it was going to be okay?
Just she had a comment that it seems like anti-Semitism was basically rampant at this time, and I think the comments from Patton were I think extreme even for the times, but perhaps not all that extreme. And certainly in the immigration quotas, in the treatment of the prisoners at the camps, you certainly saw rampant anti-Semitism.
And
Can I ask you a question?
I think many of those handling these people on our side were simply pragmatic in that they saw their objective solely focused on the Cold War, and if these people could be helpful, that was their only consideration. I don't know that necessarily meant that they were anti-Semitic, but that it didn't matter what they had done in the past if they could be helpful in the future. Okay, thank you, Jamie.